good evening and welcome. Tonight, let me take you somewhere very old and very quiet. Not to a marble city with its temples and its emperors, but to a forested continent at the edge of written history, where a people lived who never wrote their own story down, and yet shaped the soul of Europe for 1,000 years. The story of the Celts does not begin on a battlefield, though there will be battles enough before the night is through. It does not begin with a king or a conqueror or a date you were made to memorize in school. It begins underground. It begins deep inside a mountain in the Austrian Alps, in the dark, with a single flickering lamp, where a miner, nearly 3,000 years ago, swings a bronze pick against a glittering wall of salt. Salt was wealth. Salt was life. And the wealth it bought would build the first great chapter of a civilization we are only now learning to read. From that mountain of salt, the story spreads outward, across a continent, into forests so ancient and so deep that the light beneath the oaks turns green, and the mist never fully lifts, and somewhere among the trees, someone is always watching. They are watching from behind faces marked with blue. Their hair, stiffened white with lime, rises like the manes of strange beasts. Around their throats they wear rings of twisted gold. They are farmers and metalsmiths and mothers, and they are also the most feared warriors in the ancient world. Tonight we are going to follow them, all of them, from the very beginning to the very end. From the salt mines of the Alps to the flowing golden art that still turns and spirals after 2,500 years. We will stand in Rome in the year the Celts burned it to the ground, and hear a war chief throw his sword onto the scales of ransom and say 2 words the Romans would never forget: woe to the conquered. We will climb to a lonely hilltop in Gaul called Alesia, where a young leader who did the impossible, who united a people who could not be united, makes his last stand against Julius Caesar behind 40 miles of Roman walls. We will walk into the sacred groves of the Druids, the memory keepers who spent 20 years learning knowledge they refused to ever write down, and who carried it unwritten into the silence of the grave. And we will end in a small stone monastery on the western edge of the world, in the light of a single candle, where a monk bends over a page and traces a spiral of impossible beauty, the old art and the new faith, flowing together like 2 rivers meeting. It is a story that has no capital city and no single king. A story held together not by an empire, but by language, by art, by fierce and stubborn pride, and by the refusal again and again, across 2,000 years, to be forgotten. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are tonight. Leave a comment and tell me the name of your town and what time it is where you are as you settle in. There is something quietly wonderful in knowing that all around the world, others are lying in the dark, listening to this same old story under different skies. And if you find that these long, slow journeys through history help carry you gently into sleep, you might consider subscribing, but only if they truly bring you rest. There is no need otherwise. Your peace tonight matters more than any number. So there is nothing left to do now but let the day go. Let your shoulders grow heavy. Let the tension drain from your hands, from your jaw, from behind your eyes. You do not have to remember any of this. You only have to listen. Let your breathing slow. Let the sounds of the room grow distant. Let the mist rise between the ancient trees, soft and pale and cool, until the whole world feels as though it is just beyond the edge of clear seeing. We are going back now. Far back. Past Rome, past the written word, to the shores of cold alpine lakes and the mouth of a salt mine in the mountains, to the place where the long story of the Celts begins. There is a word we reach for the moment we speak of these people, and it is a word that carries more confidence than it deserves. We say Celt as though it named a single nation, a people with one flag, one throne, one homeland, the way we might say Egypt or Rome. But the truth is gentler and stranger than that, and to understand the Celts at all, we must first loosen our grip on the very word we use to hold them. It was not a name they gave themselves. It was a name given to them by others, by neighbors looking in from the outside. The Greeks, encountering these tall and unfamiliar peoples pressing at the edges of their world, called them Keltoi. The Romans later spoke of the Galli and the Celti. These were labels of convenience, broad brushstrokes painted by strangers across an enormous and varied canvas of tribes and tongues and territories. And that canvas was vast almost beyond imagining. Under this single borrowed word we gather peoples who lived thousands of miles apart, who never met, who never traded a word or shared a fire. A warrior standing on a green hillside in Ireland and a warrior riding the dry plateaus of what is now central Turkey would both be called Celtic by us today, and yet the two of them, had they somehow met, would have looked upon one another as complete and utter strangers. For they almost certainly did not think of themselves as one great people. Their loyalty, their sense of belonging, ran to something far closer and warmer than any grand idea of nationhood. They belonged to their tribe, to their clan, to the local king whose hall they gathered in, to the valley and the river and the sacred grove they had always known. The wider world of Celts is a map we have drawn long after the fact, looking down from a great height they never had. And yet, and this is the quiet wonder at the heart of it, the threads are real. Across all those miles and all those centuries, we find the same swirling artistic patterns worked into gold and bronze. We find echoes of the same religious sensibilities, the same reverence for water and for wood. We find social structures that rhyme with one another, and beneath the many spoken tongues, a common linguistic root, like a single deep spring feeding many separate streams. So perhaps the better way to think of them is not as a nation at all, but as a civilization, and a peculiar kind of civilization at that. Loose where others were tight, scattered where others were gathered, held together not by the machinery of a single state, not by a capital or a code of laws sent out from one center, but by something softer and more enduring, by language, by art, by shared values, by a particular way of seeing and meeting the world. This is what makes them so difficult to hold, and so worth the holding. There is no throne room where their story begins, no founding city, no first emperor whose reign we can point to. Instead, there is a scattering of graves and hill forts, of ornaments and weapons and the faint impressions of vanished languages. And out of that scattering, patiently, we assemble a portrait of a people who were never quite one people at all. And if we wish to find where this long story truly opens, we must set aside the grand capitals of the ancient world and go instead to a small and quiet place. High in the Austrian Alps, folded between steep mountains and cold, still water, there sits a village whose name has come to mark the very first chapter of Celtic civilization. It is to that village, and to the treasure hidden beneath it, that we now turn. Picture the village of Hallstatt as the light fails on a winter afternoon. It clings to a narrow shelf of land between the mountainside and the lake, its houses stacked one above another as though leaning together for warmth. The water below is deep and dark and very old, mirror still in the cold, and around it the peaks rise sheer into a sky the color of pewter. It is a place that feels hidden, tucked away, and for a very long time its greatest secret lay hidden too. Then, in the 19th century, the earth on the slopes above the village began to give up that secret. Excavators working the high ground uncovered a cemetery of extraordinary size, more than 1,000 graves, laid into the mountain over the course of centuries. The dead had been buried there roughly between 800 and 450 years before the Common Era, and from those long undisturbed resting places emerged a civilization we now name after this very village, the Hallstatt period, the first great phase of the Celtic world. What lay within those graves spoke of a people far richer and more connected than their remote mountain home might suggest. There were weapons of iron and bronze, laid beside the dead with care. There was jewelry of real sophistication, worked by skilled and patient hands. There was pottery shaped with quiet artistry. These were not the leavings of a poor and isolated folk. They were the possessions of a society that had wealth and knew what to do with it. And the origins of the finer things told an even larger story. Amber, warm and golden, had traveled down from the distant shores of the Baltic Sea. Coral, red and strange, had come up from the far Mediterranean. Beads of glass had made their way from workshops in the Near East, passing hand to hand across half a world before coming to rest in a grave above an alpine lake. These small treasures were the footprints of trade, proof that even here, in this hidden fold of the mountains, the wider world was near. But of all the things that made Hallstatt rich, one was greater than the rest, and it was the plainest of them all. Salt. Deep in the mountain above the village lay some of the oldest salt mines in the entire world, and it was salt, more than gold or amber or coral, that gave this place its reason to exist and its power to endure. We forget, in an age of plenty, what salt once meant. It preserved meat and fish through the long dark of winter, when nothing grew and hunger waited at the door. It gave savor to bread and broth. It was quite simply a form of life made solid, and because it was so precious, it was also a kind of wealth you could carry, trade, and hoard. The salt drawn from this mountain flowed outward along the trade roads of Europe, and back along those same roads flowed the riches we find in the graves. The very name of the place remembers it. In the old tongue, hall meant salt, as it still echoes in the German word Salz. And so a certain kind of society took shape in the salt-rich mountains, a society ruled by warrior elites, by families who controlled the mines and the metals and grew powerful on what they controlled. These were also among the earliest peoples in Europe to work iron on a large scale, and that mattered more than it might seem. Iron was harder than bronze, and it held its edge longer. The people who mastered it held a quiet, decisive advantage over those who had not. They were, it must be said, also a people who knew how to enjoy their wealth. Among the finest graves we find the equipment of drinking, vessels and cups, and the elegant apparatus of the feast. Wine came north from the Mediterranean, carried up in exchange for tin and amber, for furs and for other, more sorrowful cargo, and the Celtic elite took gladly to the drinking customs of the south. In this small thing we glimpse a larger pattern, one that would come to define them. They absorbed what came to them from beyond, and they made it their own. As their power grew, these elites raised themselves places worthy of it, fortified centers set upon high ground, which scholars have come to call the princely seats. From such strongholds the powerful watched over the trade roads and the salt roads, gathered wealth to themselves and displayed it. These were not merely refuges in time of danger. They were the beating hearts of a whole economy, places where goods were made, exchanged, and consumed in abundance. One of these seats, the Huneberg on the upper reaches of the Danube, offers up a detail so surprising it is worth pausing over. In the 6th century before the Common Era, its people built a defensive wall, not of the timber and earth and stone one might expect in a northern forest, but of sun-dried mud brick laid upon a stone footing. This was a Mediterranean technique, learned from Greek and Etruscan traders, and to find it here is astonishing. A community deep in the woodlands of southern Germany raising a wall in the manner of the sunlit south, 600 years before the birth of Christ. For a time, this world flourished, wealth gathering into fewer and fewer hands, hierarchy hardening, the princely seats glittering above the trade roads. And then, around 450 years before the Common Era, something shifted. The great strongholds fell quiet and were abandoned. The old Hallstatt order, so long established, came apart. It was not an ending, though it must have felt like one to those who lived through it. It was a threshold, and beyond it lay a newer, bolder, more restless chapter of the Celtic story. The new chapter takes its name, as the old one did, from a quiet place beside cold water. On the shore of Lake Neuchâtel in what is now Switzerland lies a site called La Tine, and the objects drawn from its shallows gave a name to the phase of Celtic civilization that would flower for the next 4 centuries. If the Hallstatt world was the civilization taking root, La Tine is the civilization in full and unmistakable bloom. And if you should remember nothing else of the Celts, not their kings, not their battles, not the tangle of their tribes, then remember this, remember their art. For here, above all, they left something that needs no translation, something that still reaches across the silence of the centuries and speaks directly to the eye. Latin art is fluid, abstract, alive, and once you have seen it, you will never afterward mistake it for anything else. to feel what made it new, set it beside the art of the Mediterranean. The Greeks and the Romans, the Etruscans too, sought after the real, the true proportions of the human body, the balance and symmetry of the natural form, the world rendered faithfully in marble and in bronze. Their genius was the genius of accuracy, of the thing seen clearly and shown as it is. The Celtic craftsman wanted something else entirely. He took the forms of the natural world, the curl of a leaf, the sweep of a wave, the coil of a beast, the tendril of a climbing plant, and he did not copy them. He transformed them. Under his hands they became flowing, interlocking curves, patterns that twist and double back and seam, even fixed forever in cold metal or hard stone, to be quietly in motion. Chief among these forms is the Celtic spiral, and to gaze at one for any length of time is to feel its strange and gentle pull. It turns and never arrives, endlessly winding inward or outward, suggesting movement without end. It speaks, many believe, of transformation and of cycles, of birth giving way to death giving way, in its turn to birth again, the great slow wheel of things forever coming round. The people who made these things were metalworkers of the very first rank, among the finest craftsmen the ancient world ever produced. They worked in gold and in silver, in bronze and in iron, coaxing from each its own particular beauty. What they made was not mere decoration. It was a way of thinking made visible, a whole vision of the world pressed and hammered and incised into the surface of precious things. And of all the things they made, none proclaimed rank and dignity quite like the torque. This was the neck ring, heavy, twisted, worn close about the throat, and it was the great and unmistakable emblem of the Celtic elite. To wear one was to declare, without a single word, who and what you were. Warriors were said to go into danger wearing little else, trusting the golden ring at the neck to speak of their standing to friend and foe alike. Among the most breathtaking of these that has ever come to light is the great torque found at Snetisham, in Norfolk. It holds close to 1 kilogram of gold, alloyed with silver for strength, and its many strands are twisted together like the fibers of a great rope, gathered at the ends into rings worked in the full flowing style of lateen. It is not too much to call it one of the most beautiful pieces of jewelry ever shaped by human hands. Hold it in your mind for a moment, that shining ring, drawn from the English earth after lying hidden for the better part of 2,000 years. The hands that made it are long dust. The name of its maker is lost past all recovering, as is the name of the one who wore it and the one who buried it away. And yet the thing itself endures, undimmed, still turning the light. This is the quiet miracle of lateen. The kingdoms it adorned are gone. The tongues its makers spoke have mostly fallen silent. The battles they fought have faded into a few dim lines in the histories of their enemies. But the art remains, patient, luminous, alive with movement, and after 2,500 years, when so much else has been lost, it still speaks. While the craftsmen bent over their gold, the world of the Celts was on the move. between roughly 400 and 200 years before the Common Era. People speaking Celtic tongues spread out across an area so enormous it is difficult to take in at a single glance. Far beyond the old Alpine heartland they went, until the Celtic world touched nearly every corner of the European map. They moved west into the land that would become France, and beyond it into the Iberian Peninsula, and across the water into the British Isles. They moved east into the broad basin of the Carpathians, down into the Balkans, and further still into the very heart of Asia Minor. And they moved south, spilling down over the mountains into the sunlit plains of Italy itself. In every direction, it seemed, the tide was rising. Yet we must not picture this as a single great march, some vast army setting out with one purpose from one place. It was nothing so tidy. It was a slow, tangled, generations-long process, driven by many things at once, by the pressure of growing populations upon limited land, by a restless hunger for new fields and new pastures, and by a warrior culture that loved adventure for its own sake and never turned easily from the promise of it. And when they arrived in a new land, they arrived in many different ways. Sometimes they settled quietly, taking up empty ground alongside the peoples already there and living beside them in peace. Sometimes they came as hired swords, warriors offering their skill and their courage to whoever would pay for it. And sometimes, it is true, they came as conquerors and stayed on to rule what they had taken. But wherever they went, they carried the same things with them: their language, their swirling art, their ways of ordering society, their gods and their sacred customs. And wherever they settled, they did what they had always done. They adapted. They mingled with local peoples and local traditions, and out of that mingling grew cultures that were hybrids, new and particular to each place, and yet, beneath it all, still unmistakably Celtic. Consider the Celtiberians, who took root in the rugged uplands of Spain. They raised fortified towns upon the hills, defensible and proud. They developed a script of their own in which to set down their words. And they earned, above all, a lasting reputation for the fierceness with which they defended what was theirs, a stubbornness that the great powers of the age would learn, to their cost, not to underestimate. That stubbornness found its darkest and most enduring emblem at the town of Numantia. When Rome laid siege to it, the defenders held on far past the point where hope had any reasonable place, and when at last the end came, in the year 133 before the Common Era, the story tells that the people chose an end of their own making rather than surrender. So terrible and so total was their defiance that Numantia passed into the Roman tongue itself as a byword for courage pushed to the very edge of despair. Step back now and look at what had come to be. By around 300 years before the Common Era, the Celtic world reached, in a great unbroken arc, from the green mist of Ireland in the far west to the dry highlands of central Turkey in the distant east. It was, in that moment, the largest cultural zone in all of Europe, a span of land and peoples that no other civilization of the age could match. And here is the wonder of it, and the riddle. This immense world had no central government to guide it. No capital city drew its threads together. No single ruler wore a crown over all of it, and no bureaucracy counted its people or collected its taxes or wrote down its laws. It was bound instead by the old soft ties, by shared language, by shared art, by shared custom, and by the fierce, proud independence of each separate tribe. That independence was the great glory of the Celtic world, and it was also, in the end, its deepest wound. The very looseness that let it spread so far and adapt so readily also left it without a center that could gather it, without a single hand that could unite it in the hour of danger. Its strength and its vulnerability were one and the same thing, and that would matter greatly when a more disciplined and single-minded power began, at last, to press against its borders. Of all the threads that bind this scattered world together, the strongest and the deepest is the one we can least see and most surely trace: language. Beneath the many separate tongues of the Celtic peoples runs a shared inheritance, and it is by following that inheritance backward that we come closest to touching what, if anything, made them kin. The Celtic languages are a branch upon a far greater tree, the Indo-European family, that vast and ancient stock from which so many of the world's tongues descend. In their shared roots, in the bones of their grammar, in words that echo one another across great distances, we read the signature of a common origin, a single source lying somewhere far back in the deep past, before the branching began. Within the Celtic branch itself, scholars have long marked two great limbs. On the one hand stand the Goidelic languages, Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, which held on to an old, hard sound, a KW, that stayed near to a K or a Q. On the other stand the Brythonic languages, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, in which that same old sound softened and shifted into a P. It seems the smallest of differences, a sound turning gently from one shape into another on the tongue. And yet that small shift marks a deep and ancient dividing of the ways, a parting of the branches so long ago that no memory of it survives except the one held, unknowing, in the mouths of those who still speak these languages today. In such quiet places does history hide its oldest secrets. Once, these tongues were spoken across the greater part of Western and Central Europe, from ordinary mouths in countless ordinary places. Today they have withdrawn to the far western margins of the continent, to Ireland and to Scotland, to Wales, to Brittany across the water in France, and to the small green Isle of Man. They are now counted among the most endangered language families in all of Europe, voices grown thin where once they filled the air. Some, indeed, came very near to falling silent forever. Cornish and Manx each faded, in their time, to the point where no community any longer spoke them as a living, everyday tongue, and there the story might have ended. But it did not. People who loved these languages set themselves to bring them back, gathering the old words and teaching them anew, and against every expectation the voices were kindled once more. That survival, against centuries of steady pressure from the great tongues of English and of French, is a testament to something that lies at the very core of Celtic identity. People held fast to their languages through hardship and discouragement and long decline, and they did so for a reason simple and profound, because the language was not merely something they used. It was who they were. And so we come to the heart of a lingering question. one that has waited quietly beneath everything we have said. If the Celts left us their art and their languages, their graves and their gold, but built no great archive and wrote, for the most part, no histories of their own, then how do we know them at all? For so much of what we believe about these people comes not from their own hand, but from the pens of others, from the written words of the very strangers who first gave them their name. And it is to those sources, and to what they reveal and conceal, that we must turn next. Almost everything we think we know about the ancient Celts was written by strangers. The words that survive came not from Celtic hands but from Greek and Roman ones, from men who lived across the sea or across the mountains, who spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, and who looked upon the Celtic world from the outside as travelers, merchants, generals, and collectors of curiosities. It is a strange and humbling thing, when you sit with it in the quiet, to realize that an entire civilization comes down to us mostly through the eyes of those who found it foreign. And these outsiders were never neutral. They wrote for audiences back home who would likely never meet a Celt, audiences who wanted their expectations confirmed, their sense of their own superiority gently flattered. Some wrote to justify a conquest, some to entertain, some simply to hold up the barbarian as a mirror, so that by describing the savage they might define the civilized. Their assumptions traveled with them quietly the way our own assumptions travel with us, unnoticed into everything we describe. The historian Polybius, who watched Celtic warriors fight, called them brave beyond question, terrifying in the first rush of battle, but lacking, he said, the patience and endurance for a long and grinding fight. There is surely some truth in this, for many observers said the same. But threaded through it is a very Greek idea of what proper warfare ought to look like, a quiet judgment about discipline and restraint that tells us as much about Polybius as it does about the Celts he was measuring. Our fullest account of Celtic life comes from Julius Caesar, who spent years at war in Gaul and wrote down what he saw. His book is a marvel, clear and vivid and beautifully composed, and it remains our single richest window into that vanished world. Yet we must never forget that it is also the work of a conqueror explaining his conquest, a man building his own name in Rome, and his Gaul is a place of brave but quarrelsome tribes who, the story gently suggests, would be better off beneath the ordered peace of Rome. Others added their pieces to the picture. Strabo the geographer, Diodorus the collector of histories, Pliny the tireless gatherer of natural wonders, each set down details about Celtic customs and appearance and belief. All of them wrote from the outside. All of them carried their biases the way any of us carry the weather of our own time and place, so that even their most careful observations come to us tinted, like light passing through colored glass. What we almost never hear in all of this is the sound of a Celtic voice speaking for itself. The Celts possessed a deep and powerful tradition of spoken memory, of poetry and law and story carried in the mind, but as a rule they did not write, and their Druids expressly forbade the setting down of sacred knowledge in letters. So we hear about the Celts endlessly, in 100 outside voices, and we hear from them almost never. The closest we come to an inside voice arrives late and from an unexpected quarter. Centuries after the old world had passed, Christian monks in Ireland took up their pens and wrote down the tales and traditions that had lived until then only on the breath of storytellers. Those pages preserve something genuinely old, something that feels like it rises from the Celtic imagination itself. And yet, even these were copied by Christian hands in a Christian age, shaped by the beliefs of the men who saved them. So we find ourselves, in a very real sense, reconstructing a whole civilization from its shadows, from reflections cast on the walls of other people's writings. It is a task that should make us gentle and cautious, slow to declare what the Celts surely believed or certainly did. And there is a kind of quiet beauty in that caution, in holding a lost world lightly, in admitting how much of it has slipped forever beyond our knowing. Let us turn now to how the Celts arranged themselves, one among another, for their society was layered and competitive and intensely, almost achingly personal. It was not built around great cities in the way of Greece and Rome. The Celts raised large fortified strongholds, the places we call oppida, but most people lived scattered across the land in farmsteads and small villages, each household bound by loyalty to a local lord. Power in this world was not a thing that lived in institutions or offices or written constitutions. It lived in persons. It flowed from a man's charisma and his generosity, from his skill in war, from the family he was born into and the followers he could gather. To understand the Celts, you must picture authority not as a building but as a bond, a living current running from one human being to another, warm and strong and, for that very reason, fragile. At the summit stood the kings. The Gaulish word was rix, a word that reaches back into deep antiquity and stands as cousin to the Latin rex and the Sanskrit raja, an echo of a shared and ancient inheritance. Yet these kings were not masters who ruled by their whim alone. They governed with the consent of their warrior nobility, could be set aside if they lost that trust, and were often chosen from among the royal kin by the leading men of the tribe. Below the king ranged the warrior aristocracy, the proud fighting nobility who rode to battle on horseback or stood tall in their chariots. They held land, they kept their own bands of sworn followers, and they contended endlessly, one against another, for standing and for honor. Their whole world turned on the question of rank, on who stood higher and who lower, and that question was never settled for long. This striving was as personal as anything can be. A nobleman's very sense of himself was woven together with his reputation, with the fame attached to his name, with the tales that would be told of him around the fire when the meat was eaten and the cups went round. To be forgotten was a kind of death, and to be spoken of with admiration was a kind of immortality, and a man might risk a great deal to secure it. Nowhere did this show more clearly than at the great communal feast, which was far more than a shared meal. It was a political stage, an institution in its own right. Where a man sat revealed exactly where he stood, for the seating mirrored the hierarchy of the tribe. The way the food was portioned out declared each guest's worth aloud, and the choicest cut of all, the champion's portion, was set before the warrior judged bravest of them all. And that single honor, the sources tell us, could turn a feast tense as a drawn bowstring, for more than one man might believe himself the worthiest, and the claim to the champion's portion could pass from words into the shadow of a quarrel. It sounds strange to us that a cut of meat could carry such weight. But in a world where honor was substance and reputation was survival, the portion was never really about the meat at all. The philosopher Posidonius, who traveled among the Celts, left us a picture of these gatherings. He described the warriors seated in a great circle, the most powerful among them at the center like the hub of a wheel, with wine poured for the wealthy and beer for the common folk, and everywhere, running beneath it all, the constant quiet contest for esteem. It is a scene both grand and human, a whole society arranged around a fire. Beneath the warriors stood the free commoners, the farmers and craftsmen and traders who were the broad body of the people, possessed of their own rights and bound by their own obligations. And beneath them again were the unfree, the slaves and bondsmen, some taken as captives in war, others sunk into servitude by debt. It was a world of clear and settled degrees, each person knowing the rung on which they stood. The thread that held this whole fabric together was the bond between patron and client, what the Romans named clientela. A lord kept his greatness only by giving, by pressing gifts upon his followers, fine weapons and cattle and gleaming ornaments, and in return he received their loyalty, their service, a share of what their labor brought forth. Generosity was not merely a virtue here. It was the very mechanism of power, the way status was earned and held. Yet because these bonds were personal, they could also be broken, and so the whole structure trembled with a permanent instability, loyalty always able to be withdrawn and given elsewhere. Two great values steadied it. The first was hospitality, a sacred duty to welcome and feed and shelter the traveler, whoever he might be. The second was honor, a matter so real it was written into law, where an insult demanded compensation, carefully weighed against a person's rank, a debt the Celts called the honor price. Of all the faces of the Celtic world, none has lingered so long in the imagination, or been so thoroughly misunderstood, as the Druids. Close your eyes and the image assembles itself almost on its own. White-robed figures moving through a moonlit grove, a golden sickle lifted to cut the pale mistletoe, an air of secret and immemorial wisdom. It is a lovely picture. It is also, in nearly every particular, a later invention. The truth is stranger, and in its way far more remarkable. For the Druids were nothing so narrow as forest mystics. They were the whole learned class of Celtic society, its thinkers and keepers of knowledge. They were priests, yes, but also judges and teachers and counselors, watchers of the stars and students of the natural world, poets and historians and guardians of everything sacred. In a single word we tend to hear only religion, but their office gathered up nearly all the intellectual life of their people into one honored calling. In a world that did not lean upon writing, the Druids were the living libraries. Everything that mattered, they carried in their minds. The laws of the tribe, the long descent of its families, the proper order of the rituals, the tales and the star lore and the healing knowledge, all of it lived in trained human memory, passed from one generation to the next on the breath, held not in books but in people who had given their lives to remembering. Caesar tells us that young men of good family might spend as long as 20 years in study to become Druids, committing to memory a vast body of verse, more, perhaps, than any course of learning we know today. 20 years. Imagine it, the patience of it, a lifetime's youth given over to holding within oneself the accumulated understanding of an entire people, line by line, until it was as much a part of you as your own name. And here is the thing that gives one pause. The Druids knew the Greek alphabet and used it readily for everyday matters, for accounts and ordinary records. Yet they refused, deliberately and as a matter of principle, to set down their sacred knowledge in writing. They held that such knowledge was not for everyone, that it should be earned and not merely read, and they believed, too, that leaning upon the written word quietly weakens the living power of memory. There is something both admirable and deeply sorrowful in that choice. Admirable in its profound respect for the disciplined human mind, for what a person can become who truly commits to remembering. And sorrowful because it meant that when at last the Druids were gone, the greater part of what they knew went with them into silence, unwritten and therefore unrecoverable. A whole ocean of learning evaporated, leaving only the faintest trace of salt upon the air. In the daily life of the tribes, the Druids presided over the rituals that marked the turning of the year. They read the meaning in omens and signs. They stood as mediators between the human world and the world of the gods, and they kept the sacred calendars that told when the seasons of worship began and ended. Theirs was the task of tending the delicate threshold where the people met the divine, and of keeping that threshold in good order. They served, as well as judges, and their judgments carried a weight that reached beyond fines or property. A Druid could bar a person from the sacred ceremonies altogether, a penalty something like the later idea of excommunication, and in that tightly woven world it was a heavy sentence indeed. To be shut out from the rites was to be made an outcast, set apart from the community and its gods, alone in a way that touched both body and soul. They advised the kings and shaped their counsel, and they taught the rising generation, pouring the inherited wisdom of the people into new and waiting minds. And they possessed one privilege that was theirs almost alone. They moved freely from one tribe's territory into another. Where a warrior crossing such a border might mean war, the Druid crossed in peace, his sacred standing granting him a kind of safe passage through a divided and often dangerous world. Once each year, Caesar tells us, they gathered together. In the land of the Carnutes, in the central part of Gaul, held to be the very heart of the country, the Druids came from far and wide to sit in council and consider the matters they held in common. Picture that quiet assembly, learned men drawn from scattered and rival peoples, meeting not to make war but to confer, beneath the same sky, upon the things that bound them. And so the Druids became something the Celtic world otherwise lacked. In a land of proud and fractious tribes, forever contending among themselves, they were a thread of shared belief and shared learning running through them all, the nearest thing to a single, unifying institution that the Celts ever possessed. They were the quiet common ground beneath 1,000 quarrels, a brotherhood of memory in a world that agreed on little else. which is precisely why, when Rome at last came in earnest, it would mark the Druids for destruction. A conqueror can subdue tribes one by one, playing rival against rival, but a class of men who moved among all the tribes, who held the people's memory and commanded their reverence and could summon them to a shared idea of themselves, such men were dangerous in a way no single warlord could be. And Rome understood this all too well. The Druids, as a rule, did not worship beneath roofs. They raised no great temples of stone and column as the classical peoples did. Their sacred places were the places the world itself had made, the groves of old trees, the springs where water rose cold and clear from the earth, the quiet lakes, the high and windswept tops of hills. Their cathedrals had no walls, only leaves and water and open sky. There was a word for such a place, the Nemeton, and it lingers still, half-hidden, in the names of villages and rivers scattered across the map of Europe, a faint echo of old holiness worn smooth by time. A Nemeton was a sacred grove, a clearing set apart, a place where the people believed the veil between the human world and the divine grew thin, thin as morning mist, so that in the hush beneath the trees one stood very near to something greater. The classical writers described these groves with a mingling of fascination and dread. The Roman poet Lucan told of one such grove near Marseille, so ancient and so heavy with unseen presence that even its own priest feared to walk beneath its boughs. No wind, he wrote, ever stirred it, and yet the leaves trembled of their own accord, and dark waters welled up from the ground, and rough images stood watching among the trunks. We should read such accounts with care, for part of what we hear in them is Roman purpose, a wish to make Celtic faith seem primitive and frightening, and so easier to sweep away. And yet beneath the shudder there is something true. The deep kinship of Celtic belief with the living world, with trees and springs and the slow wheel of the seasons, is well attested from many quarters and was, in all likelihood, entirely genuine. And now we come to the hardest matter of all, the one it would be dishonest to pass over in silence, the question of human sacrifice. The classical sources speak of it with one voice, insisting that the Druids practiced such rites, and describing them in terms meant to disturb. We must hold this gently and remember, too, that those same writers had every reason to paint the Druids as barbarous, for a people portrayed as cruel is a people more easily conquered. How much of it was true, and how much the shadow cast by Roman purpose, is debated still and may never be fully known. There is one quiet and haunting witness, a man drawn long afterward from a peat bog in England, whom we call Lindau Man. He lived and died around the 1st century, and the ordered manner of his death has led some to see in it the marks of ritual. Other such bodies, found across the north of Europe, seem to whisper of similar patterns. The honest answer is that we cannot be certain, and honesty here matters more than a satisfying conclusion. It is worth remembering, too, that many ancient peoples walked this same dark ground at one time or another, the Romans themselves among them, before they turned away from it and forbade it. What we glimpse in the Celtic groves was not some solitary strangeness, but one shape of a shadow that lay, in that age, across much of the world. What we can say with confidence is that the authority of the Druids was real, and that their rituals were taken in deadly earnest by those who kept them. The boundary between the sacred and the fearful, between reverence and dread, simply lay in a different place in the ancient world than it does in our own, and we do these long-vanished people no service by pretending otherwise, nor by recoiling from them too quickly. So we leave the groves as the light fails within them, the dark springs welling quietly, the old trees keeping their counsel, the boundary between worlds resting where it rested then, unhurried, undisturbed. There is no need to carry any of this weight with you now. Let it settle back into the deep past where it belongs, and let the trees stand watch over it, as they have stood in silence through all the long centuries since. To understand what the Celts believed, you must first set aside the idea of a single church, a single doctrine, a single book of truth. Their religion was not one thing but many, woven differently in every valley and along every river. They honored many gods and many goddesses, and a great number of these belonged not to the whole Celtic world but to a single place. A particular spring where the water rose cold and clear, a particular hill that caught the last of the evening light, a particular grove of old trees whose silence felt like a presence. This rootedness in the land is the first thing worth holding gently in your mind. Celtic religion did not float above the world as a system of ideas. It grew up out of the ground itself, out of the specific streams and stones and shadowed places that a people lived among and came to love. Each tribe kept its own sacred associations, its own beloved powers, its own quiet understanding of which places must be approached with care. There was no single map of the divine, only countless local ones, each drawn by the hands and hearts of those who dwelt there. And yet a few great figures were known far and wide, their names carried across the whole Celtic world. Foremost among them stood Luff, the Shining One, god of skill and craftsmanship and light, master of every art at once. His name lingers still in places you may know without knowing why. The city of Lyon in France was once Lugdunum, the fort of Luff, and so his memory is folded quietly into the map of Europe to this day. There was the Dagda, whose name means simply the good god, good not in the sense of gentle, but in the sense of good at all things, capable, immense. He was a figure of enormous power and enormous appetite, and he carried a great club so heavy it had to be dragged on wheels, which could take life with one end and give it back with the other. He owned as well a cauldron that never emptied, from which no company ever went away unfed, abundance itself made into a vessel. There was Brigid, beloved goddess of healing and poetry, and the smith's bright forge, three arts that the Celts felt to be secretly one. So deep did her hold upon the people run that when Christianity came, she was not swept away but gathered in, remembered and rekindled as Saint Brigid, and hers is one of the most remarkable survivals in all the religious history of Europe, an old goddess still honored under a new name, her fires never quite allowed to go cold. And there was the Morrigan, the Phantom Queen, a darker and stranger power, goddess of war and fate and death. She was said to appear upon the field of battle in the shape of a crow, wheeling and calling above the host, and to come to certain heroes before their ending, so that a man might meet her and understand, in that meeting, what was soon to come. She was not cruelty. She was fate, wearing feathers, keeping the appointments that no one may refuse. Beyond these well-known names lay a great host of others, most of them known to us now from only the faintest trace. A single carved inscription, a single altar raised at a single crossing of a stream, a single place that once held meaning and holds it no longer. Whole gods have come down to us as little more than a name in weathered stone. And this is fitting in its way, for a faith that was always local, always particular, always bound to the here and the near rather than to the everywhere. But beneath all the many names lay one deep idea, and it is the key to everything else. The Celts did not divide the world as we so often do, into the natural on one side and the supernatural on the other. For them there was no such border. The world was a single whole, the seen and the unseen, the living and the long dead, were not separate countries but faces of one reality, and what lay between them was never a wall. The boundary, they felt, was more like a membrane than a barrier, thin in places and shifting, and at certain times and certain places dangerously easy to pass. And so they believed in another world, not a heaven to be earned by a good life, not a reward weighed out for virtue, but simply another dimension of what already is, running alongside the visible world like a second melody beneath the first. There the gods dwelt, and there the dead went, near always and only lightly hidden. One might come to it, they believed, through the old burial mounds that rose green from the fields, through the still black water of deep lakes, through the mouths of caves, through the pale mist that gathered in the valleys at dusk, and at certain sacred turnings of the year, the way stood open of its own accord. In the Irish tales it bears lovely names: Tir na Nog, the land of the young, and Mag Mell, the plain of delight, a place of beauty and abundance and unending youth, where sorrow does not come and time itself runs strange and slow. There is a story that holds all the ache of that belief. Oisin, a hero and a poet, went away into the land of the young with a woman of the other world, and there he lived what seemed to him a few sweet seasons. But when at last he longed for home and returned, he found 300 years had passed in his short absence. The people he had loved were dust, his world was gone, and he was a stranger in the land of his birth. In that single tale lives the whole of a truth every human heart already knows: that we cannot go back, that what we love does not wait, that time carries all things away. And here is the last thing, the thing the Romans noticed with a kind of wonder. Because the Celts believed the soul did not die, that death was a doorway a person walked through, and not a wall a person struck against, they could meet their own ending with a calm, and sometimes a fearlessness, that astonished those who watched them. If the self goes on, then death loses much of its terror. It becomes a crossing rather than a stopping. Hold that thought gently as we go on. That to these people, the dark was never quite as final as it seems. Now let us set aside the gods for a while, and follow instead the slow turning of the Celtic year. Let your breathing lengthen as we go. The year for these people moved not in the straight line we imagine but in a great wheel, turning round and round through the seasons, marked at 4 points by 4 great fires, festivals that measured out the rhythm of the herds in the fields, and gathered the scattered people into a shared and sacred time. The first of these, and in a way the greatest, was Samhain, which fell around the first days of November. This was the Celtic New Year and the doorway into winter, the moment when the harvest was gathered and the cold drew near, and it was, above all, the night when the membrane between the worlds grew thinnest of all, when the dead might walk once more among the living. From this ancient night, across long centuries, our Halloween is descended, a faint and playful echo of something once profoundly solemn. Imagine the eve of Samhain as it may have been. Across the whole land, at the Druids' word, every hearth fire in every house was let quietly die, until the darkness was complete and unbroken from valley to valley. And then a single new fire, a sacred fire, was kindled fresh, and from that one flame every household carried home its light, so that every hearth in the land was lit from the same source, every home bound to every other home, and all of them bound to the divine. It was a practical time as well as a holy one. The animals that could not be fed through the long hungry months were brought in, and their meat was salted and preserved to carry the people through to spring. And on that same night, food was set out for the ancestors who were thought to return, a place laid at the table, a portion left by the fire. For Samhain was not only a night of fear. It was also a night of reunion, when those who had gone ahead were welcomed quietly home, and no chair by the hearth stood truly empty. Then the wheel turned on through the deep of winter to Imbolc around the 1st of February. This was the first faint stirring of the spring, not yet warmth, but the promise of it. The ewes began to give their milk again, a sign of life renewing in the cold. The days grew by small and hopeful minutes longer. Imbolc belonged to the goddess Brigid, and it carried within it, like a seed in frozen ground, the whole certainty that the light was returning. The wheel turned again, and now to Beltane around the 1st of May, the threshold of summer and a festival of pure life. 2 great bonfires were built and set ablaze, and the cattle were driven slowly between them, passing through the cleansing smoke before they went out to the high summer pastures. It was a time of fertility and of growth, of green in the hedges and blossom on the branch, a time of feasting and of music and of dancing under the long soft light of the lengthening evenings. And last came Lugnasad, around the 1st of August, named for Luff the shining god, the festival of the harvest's beginning. Now the first grain was cut, and the people came together from far around. Great gatherings with games and contests, with markets where goods and news and gossip were traded, with the whole community drawn into one place under the warm and heavy skies of late summer. It was gratitude made into a festival, the year's labor turning at last into bread. For fires, then, spaced evenly around the turning wheel, Samhain and Imbolc, Beltane and Lugnasad, the dark and the first stirring, the full bloom and the ripening. Each one gathered the far-flung households out of their daily solitude and joined them to the season, to the land, and to one another. To live by this calendar was to feel oneself always held within a rhythm larger than any single life, a rhythm that had turned before you and would go on turning after. So let the year turn now in your mind, slowly, as a wheel turns, winter into spring, spring into summer, summer round again to the dark. feel how there is no ending in a wheel, only return. How every death of the light was also the promise of its coming again. How the people who lived this way were never truly lost in the seasons, but always carried along by them, cradled in the great and patient motion of the year. And now let the fire burn low. Let the last of the festival settle into quiet. The year is turning as it has always turned. The ancestors are near, as they were always thought to be near, and there is nothing you must do but rest here a while, held in the old rhythm, safe in the long slow wheel of the seasons, sinking gently down towards sleep. Let us turn now to the women of the Celtic world, for their place within it was, by the measure of the ancient age, genuinely remarkable. We must not paint it too brightly. This was not some lost paradise of perfect equality. It was a society ruled in its formal shape by men who held the offices and the acknowledged power. And yet within those limits, and now and then far beyond them, Celtic women moved with an independence that left Greek and Roman observers frankly astonished. Much of what we know comes from the early Irish law texts, written down in the medieval age, but preserving customs far older than the ink that recorded them. In their pages we meet women who could own property in their own right, who could inherit, who could enter into binding contracts as full parties. A woman's dowry remained legally her own, and if a marriage came to an end, it left the household with her, and not with the man she was leaving. For marriages could indeed end. Divorce was permitted among the Celts, and either the wife or the husband might set it in motion. This was no one-sided release granted only to men. And the grounds were surprisingly wide, extending even to a husband's cruelty and to his simple failure to provide for the household as he ought. A woman was not, in this world, a thing given away and then bound forever. She retained a standing and a set of rights that many later societies would have found difficult to imagine. Women could bring a suit before the law and give their evidence within it. And in certain cases they could hold real positions of authority, as judges who weighed disputes, as poets whose words carried weight and were paid for in honor, as landholders of standing enough to matter in the affairs of their people. Theirs was not merely a domestic sphere. It reached, for some, into the public life of the tribe. There was even a recognized path by which a woman might inherit land outright, the concept of the female heir, which allowed a daughter to take the family holding into her own keeping when there was no son to receive it. Land, the very foundation of wealth and standing in that world, was not held to be forever beyond a woman's grasp. It could pass to her and rest in her hands, and this alone set the Celtic world apart from much of the Mediterranean that looked on it with such surprise. The classical writers, for their part, found Celtic women formidable to the point of alarm. Ammianus Marcellinus left a famous description, exaggerated surely and half a jest, of the terror a Gaulish warrior's wife might bring to a quarrel, her strength and fury more than a match for any band of outsiders. We may smile at the picture, and yet beneath the exaggeration lies a real thing observed. These were not women who shrank into silence, and the men who met them did not forget it. Irish legend, too, kept alive the memory of women who bore arms, and, more striking still, women who taught the art of arms to others. Greatest among them was Scathach, the warrior woman of the Misty Isle, a teacher of such renown that the finest hero of the tales, Cuchulainn himself, went to her to be trained in the ways of war. That the imagination of a people should place a young hero at the feet of a woman, to learn from her the whole craft of the warrior, tells us something the law texts alone cannot. Whether Celtic women truly fought in the ranks of battle is a question scholars still turn over, and the honest answer is that we do not fully know. But this much is certain: the Celtic world could imagine the woman warrior, could honor her, could set her at the very center of its greatest stories, and that was something the classical Mediterranean, for all its philosophers and its glory, could scarcely bring itself to do. The difference lies not only in what was done, but in what could be dreamed. And there is one Celtic woman still to come in our long night's telling, one who, for a brief and terrible span, would make even Rome itself afraid. Her name and her rising we will keep for later, when the hour is right. For now it is enough to hold this picture: a world in which women owned and inherited and judged and were remembered as warriors, and in which the memory of their strength outlasted the empires that marveled at it. Now we come to the matter of war, and here we must walk gently, for the Celts were a warlike people and their warfare was fearsome, yet we will keep to the shadow and the sound of it, and not to the blood. For the Celtic nobility, war was not merely a thing done when it must be done. It was the very center of a nobleman's life, the arena in which his worth was measured, the great and glittering activity around which all his honor turned. The Celtic warrior was not a soldier as Rome understood the word. He did not lose himself in the iron discipline of the massed formation, did not become one interchangeable part of a great machine. He was first and always an individual, and the glory he sought was personal and his own, best of all won in single combat, in the open challenge, in the duel fought out where every eye could see and every voice could carry the tale of it afterward. Before the fighting came the ritual, and it was long and loud and meant to shake the nerve of any watching foe. Warriors strode out to shout their challenges, to boast aloud of their ancestry and the great deeds behind them, to sing their war songs into the morning air. They beat their weapons against their shields again and again, until the sound rose into a single wall of noise, a thunder of wood and iron rolling across the ground before ever a step was taken. And over all of it sounded the carnix, that tall bronze war horn, held high above the heads of the host, its mouth shaped into the head of some fierce beast. Its voice was a long, strange, wailing cry, pitched to carry above the din and to unsettle the heart of whoever heard it, a sound like nothing in the natural world, hanging over the gathered warriors like the call of something not quite of this earth. Some of the warriors, the old writers tell us, went into battle wearing nothing at all, no armor, no tunic, only the golden torque about the throat and the pale blue patterns of woad traced upon the skin. Why they did so we cannot say for certain. Some scholars think it a practical thing, bare skin being harder for a foe to seize. Others think it religious, the body offered up and a declaration, plain for all to see, of a fearlessness so complete it needed no protection at all. Try for a moment to imagine the sight from a little distance. Hundreds of warriors, their hair stiffened pale with lime, their skin marked with swirling blue, coming on together at a run, their horns wailing and their voices raised into one great roar. It must have been among the most overwhelming things the ancient world could show a person. A wave of noise and color and motion sweeping toward you across the open ground, meant to break the spirit before it ever reached the body. Their arms were well suited to this fighting of the bold and the personal. There was the long sword, made for the wide sweeping stroke rather than the neat thrust, and the tall oval shield, which was not only a guard but a canvas, painted and worked with the flowing, curling art of the Latin style, so that a man's protection was also a proclamation of who he was. And there was the war chariot, drawn by two small swift horses, the thing that so impressed and unsettled Julius Caesar when he met it in Britain. The drivers raced these light chariots along the lines, between the two hosts, while the warriors aboard flung their javelins from the moving platform. And then, at the chosen moment, a warrior would leap lightly down to fight on foot, his chariot wheeling away to wait and to carry him off again. It was war made into something like a fearful art. And now we come to the practice that shocked the classical world beyond all the rest, the taking of heads. To the Celts, the head was no ordinary part of the body. It was the very seat of the soul, the most sacred thing a person carried, the dwelling place of the self. And so to take the head of a fallen enemy was, in their understanding, to take his essence itself, to keep, in some sense, the very heart of who he had been. Such heads were treasured rather than discarded. Some were set above the doorways of the house. Some were carefully preserved and kept, and shown to guests with evident pride, as another people might show an heirloom or a trophy of great worth. It is a thing wholly alien to us, and we need not pretend otherwise. But it was not the empty savagery it can seem. It belonged to a whole and coherent world of belief, in which the head carried a meaning deep and sacred, and the keeping of it was an act of reverence as much as of triumph. And beyond its meaning, it had, without any doubt, an effect. A people known to keep the heads of their fallen enemies above their doors was a people not lightly attacked. All of it together, the wall of sound, the wailing horns, the painted and running warriors, the racing chariots, and the dark renown that trailed behind them, made the Celts one of the most feared peoples the ancient world ever knew. And with that thought, let the horns fade now into silence, and the field grow still, and the long night carry you gently onward. Of all the storms that broke against the ancient world during the long age of the Celts, none struck deeper into the memory of a single people than the day the city of Rome burned. It happened, by the reckoning that has come down to us, in the year 390 before the Common Era, and for the Romans it would remain the oldest and most tender of their wounds, an ache they carried for 5 centuries. Long after Rome had grown into an empire that ringed the whole of the inland sea, her people still shivered at the thought of that year, and told their children how close the young city had come to ending before it had truly begun. Tonight we will walk gently into that memory, not to dwell on suffering, but to understand why it mattered so much and for so long. To understand how the Celts came to stand inside Rome, we must first follow them down out of the mountains. In the closing years of the 5th century and the opening years of the 4th, Celtic peoples had been crossing the high alpine passes, moving south in search of better land, and finding it in the broad and fertile valley of the river Po in what is now northern Italy. The peoples already settled there, among them the Etruscans, were not strong enough to hold the newcomers back, and so the Celts came to stay. They put down roots, they mingled with those they found, and slowly a new and blended way of life took shape across that green and generous country. The names of those Celtic settlers did not vanish. Many of them are still spoken today, worn smooth by the centuries, hiding in the names of Italian cities. The Insubres made their home around the place we now call Milan. The boy gave their name in the end to Bologna. The Senans spread along the shore of the Adriatic, in the country facing the Eastern Sea. These were not passing raiders but communities, with fields and forges and families, who had come to think of the Po Valley as home. And it was the Senans, in time, under a leader whose name the Romans would never forget, who turned their faces toward the south, toward a city still young among the hills. The leader's name was Brennus, and the road that carried him to Rome began, as so many wars do, with a small and avoidable quarrel. There was an Etruscan city called Clusium, and it found itself pressed by the Celts, and it sent word to Rome asking for help in making peace. Rome sent ambassadors, men whose task was to stand between the two sides and cool the heat of the dispute. But instead of keeping to that calm and neutral duty, the Roman envoys took up arms and joined the fighting against the Celts, and one of them, it was said, killed a Celtic chieftain. To the Celtic leaders, this was a grave breach of the trust that ought to protect a messenger, and their anger was deep and just. Brennus did not answer this insult with immediate violence. First he asked for justice. He sent to Rome and demanded that the ambassadors who had broken faith be handed over to him, so that the wrong might be set right by the customs both peoples understood. But Rome refused. The men who had crossed the line were from a powerful family, and rather than surrender them, the city chose to stand behind them. And so the last door to peace swung quietly shut, and Brennus gathered the Senans and turned south along the roads that led to the young city, his host moving through the summer country with a steady and unhurried purpose. The armies met at last beside a small river called the Alesia, about 11 miles north of Rome, where the fields ran down to the water. The Roman soldiers who came out to meet the Celts were not ready for what fell upon them, and their line, once it began to give way, gave way entirely. The army broke and scattered, and many fled toward the old Etruscan town of Veii rather than back to their own walls. It was, for Rome, a day of bewilderment more than of glory, a day the calendar would forever mark as unlucky. And when the dust of it had settled and the field was still, one plain and heavy fact remained. The road to Rome lay open, and there was almost nothing left to guard it. When the Celts came at last to the city, they found much of it already emptied. Word of the disaster at the Alesia had raced ahead of them, and most of the people had gathered what they could carry and slipped away into the countryside, or crossed the river, or taken shelter in nearby towns. The Celts moved through streets that were strangely quiet, and in the days that followed the city was given over to sack and to fire. Let us hold that scene gently. Think of thin columns of smoke rising into a summer sky, of the low crackle of flame in empty doorways, of a hush settling over squares where markets had lately been loud. It was a hard hour, and yet the city itself was only stone and timber, and stone and timber can be raised again. Not all of Rome had fled. Upon the Capitoline Hill, the steepest and most defensible of the city's heights, a garrison of fighting men had gathered, and with them some of the older senators who would not leave, and there they held out above the smoke. The hill rose in cliffs on its steeper sides, and while the lower city lay open, that high citadel did not fall. For weeks the two sides faced one another, the Celts below and the defenders above, the one unable to climb and the other unable to break out, while hunger began its slow and patient work on both. And it was in the deep of one such night that the most famous moment of the whole siege is said to have unfolded. The story, as the Romans lovingly told it, runs like this. Under cover of darkness, a party of Celts found a hidden path up the cliff and began to climb in perfect silence, hand over hand, so quietly that the sentries did not stir and even the watchdogs slept on. But upon that hill there stood a temple to the goddess Juno, and around it lived a flock of geese kept sacred to her, and the geese, hungry though everyone was, had not been touched. As the first climbers reached the top, the geese woke, and set up such a clamor of honking and beating wings that a Roman named Marcus Manlius started from his sleep, seized his weapons, and rushed to the edge in time to throw the foremost climbers back. The assault failed, and the geese of the capital passed into legend, remembered with affection for 1,000 years. In the end, neither hill nor siege could last forever, and both sides were weary of it. A bargain was struck. The Celts would depart, and in return Rome would pay a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold. But when the gold was being weighed out, the Romans protested that the Celtic scales were false, tipped to demand more than was fair. It was then that Brennus, with a warrior's grim humor, drew his heavy sword and threw it, scabbard and all, onto the scale beside the weights, so that the price rose higher still. And he spoke 2 short words that the Latin tongue would carry down the ages. Vi victis. Woe to the conquered! Woe to the conquered! It is a hard saying, and the Romans took it as such, and they never let themselves forget it. In the years that followed, they raised their walls higher and drilled their soldiers harder, and something cold and watchful settled into the way they thought about the world beyond their borders. To be caught unready, as they had been at the Alesia, became for them a kind of nightmare, and the memory of the burning became a spur that drove them on. What had felt like the end of Rome became, in a strange and lasting way, part of the making of it. And there is a long irony folded into that summer of 390, one worth holding as we leave it. The humiliation the Celts dealt to Rome did not weaken the city so much as it hardened her, and in the fullness of centuries it would be Rome who marched north across the Po and over the Alps and into the very heartlands of the Celtic world, until the peoples who had once stood inside her gates were themselves gathered into her empire. History rarely settles its accounts quickly, but it settles them. For now, though, let the smoke thin and drift away, and let the geese fall silent on their hill, and let us carry the memory of that year forward as the Romans did, quietly, and for a very long time. It would be a mistake to picture the Celtic world as a place apart, sealed off in its forests and hills from the shining civilizations of the South. From the beginning and all through its long history, the Celtic world lived in close and constant conversation with the great cultures of the Mediterranean and the lands beyond it, with the Greeks and the Romans, with the Carthaginians of the African shore, and with the Etruscans of Italy. Goods passed back and forth, and with the goods went ideas and fashions and stories, so that a chieftain in distant Gaul might drink his wine from a cup shaped by a hand in the warm and busy cities of the south. The threads that bound this world together ran far, and they ran in both directions. Among the things the Celtic lands sent out into that wider world were their warriors, for the reputation of the Celtic fighting man had spread across every sea. He was known for his courage and his fury in battle, and any ruler who could afford to hire him was glad to have him, so that Celtic swords were drawn in quarrels far from home. They served Dionysius, the powerful ruler of Syracuse in Sicily. They marched under the banners of Carthage, and some of them crossed the Alps and came down into Italy in the great host of Hannibal. And they hired themselves out to the wealthy kingdoms that the successors of Alexander had carved from his empire in the east, wherever a strong arm was wanted and there was coin to pay for it. Service in distant armies did more than fill a warrior's purse. It opened his eyes. A man who had fought beside Greeks or served a Carthaginian paymaster came home having seen other ways of doing things, other tools, other customs, and some of what he had seen traveled home with him. It has been thought, for instance, that the way certain Celtic tribes came to make and use coins of their own may owe something to warriors who had been paid in the coin of Greece or Rome, and who brought both the metal and the idea back across the mountains. So the mercenary was not only a sword for hire but, without ever meaning to be, a carrier of knowledge, a quiet bridge between worlds. Beneath the movement of warriors ran the deeper and steadier current of trade, binding the Celtic lands to the whole economy of the Mediterranean. Out of the north flowed raw and precious things, tin dug from the ground in Britain and in Brittany, so needful for the making of bronze, amber gathered along the cold shores of the Baltic, iron from the great smelting centers of the Celtic country, furs and hides from the forests, and, in the harsh custom of that age, people taken captive in war. These were the goods that moved south along the roads and rivers, the plain wealth of a wide and productive land making its way toward the markets of the sea. And in return, the south sent its luxuries flowing north. Wine came, and olive oil, and fine painted pottery, and vessels of worked bronze and glass, and coral from the warm seas, all the delicate and beautiful things that the workshops of the Mediterranean made so well. Among the Celtic elite, these were far more than pleasures. They were the very language of standing and power. To pour wine for one's followers from a graceful imported jug, to give such treasures as gifts, to be buried among them, was to show the world one's rank. In this way, a cup of southern clay could carry as much meaning as a sword, and the trade in fine things was also, quietly, the trade in prestige and influence. All this movement followed the shape of the land, and above all the courses of the great rivers. The Rhine and the Rhone, the Danube and the Seine were the highways of that age, carrying boats and barges laden with cargo deep into the heart of the continent. while the passes of the Alps let the traffic cross the mountains between north and south. To hold a stretch of one of these routes, a crossing or a narrows where goods must pass, was to hold a source of wealth and therefore of power, and much of the story of these centuries is the story of who controlled the roads that the rivers made. From the 2nd century before our era, a new kind of place rose along these routes, the oppidum, the large fortified town. These were not merely walls thrown up on a hilltop for safety in war. They were centers of living and making and exchange, and they often sat exactly where the trade roads met and crossed. Within their ramparts stood workshops and houses and quarters given over to particular crafts, and the goods found in them show ties reaching far across the ancient world. Bibracht, the great stronghold of the powerful tribe of the Aedui in central Gaul, spread across hundreds of acres, a true town in everything but name, humming with industry and commerce. So let us set aside, gently and for good, the old picture of the Celts as a rude and backward people huddled at the edge of civilization. They were not primitive. They were simply different, following their own path and keeping their own customs, and all the while they were woven firmly into the fabric of the wider world. Goods and ideas and people passed continually along their roads and rivers, moving south and moving north, so that the Celtic lands were never a closed and lonely place but a living part of a vast and interconnected age. It is a fitting thing to remember as the fire burns low, that even the far edges of the world were joined to its center by countless patient threads. Among all the journeys of the Celtic peoples, few are stranger or less remembered than the one that carried them into the heart of Asia and gave the world the Galatians. It is a tale that begins with a great migration and ends, centuries later, with Celtic speech still echoing in the highlands of what is now Turkey, and it deserves to be told softly and in full. For here we find the Celts at the very limit of their wandering, farther from their homelands than they had ever gone before, and yet holding fast, against every expectation, to the language and the customs their grandfathers had carried out of the West. In the year 279 before our era, a great Celtic army pushed down into Greece, marching south through the plains of Thessaly until it came near to Delphi, the most sacred place in all the Greek world, where the oracle of Apollo spoke among the mountains. What happened there is not clearly known, for the Greek writers who tell of it wrapped the day in wonder, speaking of sudden storms and shaking earth and the gods themselves rising to defend their shrine, until the invaders were scattered and turned back. Whatever the truth beneath the legend, the great raid into Greece broke apart, and the Celts who had come so far now had to decide where to turn. A large body of them turned east. They crossed the narrow strait of water that divides Europe from Asia and passed over into Asia Minor, the broad peninsula we now call Turkey, and there, in the high tablelands of central Anatolia, they carved out a country for themselves. It came to be called Galatia, after the Gauls who had settled it, and the name still lingers in that land. The modern city of Ankara, the capital of Turkey, was once a tribal stronghold of these very Celts. Imagine it. A fragment of the Celtic world, transplanted whole into the dry and rolling uplands of Asia, thousands of miles from the mists of Gaul, and yet unmistakably itself. What is most remarkable is how long they remained themselves. Surrounded on every side by the Greek-speaking world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, Drawn into its wars and its politics and its markets, the Galatians nonetheless held onto their own tongue, their own tribal organization, and much of their inherited way of life for century upon century. They worshipped their Celtic gods alongside the Greek ones, and spoke their Celtic speech alongside Greek, and ordered themselves and fought in the manner their people had always used. They took what suited them from the world around them, and yet they did not dissolve into it, but kept a stubborn and enduring core of who they were. To their neighbors, the Galatians were a force to be reckoned with, and often a fearsome one. The kingdoms around them, Pergamon and Bithynia and Pontus, knew the sting of Galatian raiding parties that could strike deep into settled country and demand tribute to be left in peace. For a long while these Celtic newcomers were among the powers of Asia Minor, courted by some and dreaded by others, until at last the kings of Pergamon won famous victories over them and celebrated those victories in stone and bronze. And so the Galatian warrior became not only a figure of fear but a subject of art, carved by Greek hands at the height of their skill. Out of that art comes one of the most moving images the ancient world has left us, the statue we call the Dying Gaul. It survives as a Roman copy in marble of a bronze original now lost, and it shows a wounded Galatian warrior sinking slowly forward, propped on one failing arm. The torque, the twisted collar of the Celts, still circles his neck, and his face is full of pain and yet full of dignity, the face of a brave man at the close of his strength. It is a portrait of an enemy, made by the people who defeated him, and yet it grants him his full humanity and asks us to grieve for him. Few works of ancient art reach across the centuries so gently or so surely. In the end, the Galatians, like so many peoples of that age, were gathered into the widening embrace of Rome, and their country became the Roman province of Galatia. But their story does not simply stop there, for it touches, in a quiet and unexpected way, the history of the wider world we know. When, in the first century of our era, the Apostle Paul sat down to write a letter to the Galatians, one of the letters that would become part of Christian scripture, he was writing to the descendants of these very Celtic migrants, the children's children of the warriors who had crossed out of Europe long before. The Celts of Asia had become, by then, a settled people receiving letters and pondering new faiths. And there is one more small witness to their endurance, tender and precise. Centuries after the migration, the scholar Jerome, who had traveled widely and heard many tongues, remarked that the people of Galatia still spoke a language much like the Celtic speech he had heard among the tribes of the Rhineland far away in the west. Think of what that means. Generations after their fathers had left Europe, in the very middle of Asia Minor, these people were still speaking a Celtic tongue, still carrying in their mouths the sound of a homeland their ancestors had not seen for hundreds of years. It is a small detail, and it is astonishing. This, perhaps, is the deepest lesson of the Galatians, the sheer tenacity of Celtic identity, its quiet refusal to be washed away. Across enormous distances, from the Atlantic coasts to the plateaus of Anatolia, and across enormous spans of time, from one century to the next and the next, the Celtic peoples kept hold of who they were with a persistence that still amazes. They bent and borrowed and blended, and yet some inner thread ran on unbroken. As we leave them there in their Asian highlands, speaking the old speech under a foreign sky, let us carry with us that sense of how durable a people's memory of itself can truly be. Now we turn west again, all the way west, to the very edge of the world as the ancients reckoned it, to the islands of Britain and Ireland set in their grey and restless seas. Here, at the far margin, the Celtic world would make its longest and most faithful stand, for it was in these islands that the Celtic languages and traditions would outlast every other, surviving the fall of Rome and the passing of empires, surviving, in truth, right down to our own day. There is something fitting in this, that what began far to the east should find its longest life at the western rim of things, where the land at last gives way to the open ocean. By the Age of Iron, Britain was Celtic through and through, its lands divided among dozens of tribes, each with its own king and its own stretch of country. In the south and east lay tribes such as the Catavilani, the Trinovants, and the Atrebates, who traded across the water with Gaul and with Rome, who minted their own coins, and who built large and sophisticated towns. Farther to the north and west dwelt other peoples, the Brigantes, the Siluries, the Dumnonii, living in more remote and rugged country, keeping more to their herds and their older ways, less touched by the fashions of the continent. Different as they were, they shared a common world. For all of them spoke a common kind of Celtic speech, the Brythonic tongue from which Welsh and Cornish and Breton would one day descend, and all of them followed the Celtic religion, and all of them made art in the flowing style we call Latin. And what art it was! The metalworkers of Iron Age Britain produced some of the finest work the ancient world ever saw, objects that still take the breath away, their surfaces alive with curving, balanced, endlessly inventive design. To hold the image of such a piece in the mind is to understand at once that these were no rude craftsmen, but masters working at the very height of an ancient and refined tradition. Consider the treasures that have come down to us, many of them lifted from the beds of rivers where they were laid as offerings long ago. There is the Battersea shield, drawn up out of the Thames, its bronze face worked all over with graceful, symmetrical, swirling patterns. There is the great gold torque from Snettisham, heavy and gleaming. There is the Waterloo helmet with its two proud horns, and the Desborough mirror, the back of it covered in a design so subtle and so perfectly balanced that scholars still marvel at the hand that laid it out. Each of these is a small miracle of patience and skill, a whole civilization's sense of beauty pressed into metal. And then there is Ireland, which stands apart in the whole of the Celtic story, and stands apart for a single decisive reason: Rome never came. The legions that swallowed Gaul and much of Britain never crossed the last stretch of sea to the western island, and so Ireland was never conquered, never reshaped into a Roman province, never made to set aside its old ways. Because of this, the Celtic world as it had been before the coming of the empires, its social order, its laws, its ancient store of spoken poetry and story, lived on in Ireland longer and more wholly than anywhere else on earth. It became a kind of quiet sanctuary for the old ways. When at last Christianity came to Ireland, it came not with the sword but gently, over time, spreading through the country without the violence that so often attended such changes elsewhere. And rather than sweeping the old world away, the new faith settled into it, taking its place among the structures already there, so that much of what had been was preserved rather than destroyed. In time, the Irish monasteries, with their patient scribes bent over parchment in the lamplight, would become the very keepers of the ancient oral tradition, writing down at last the tales that had lived for uncounted generations only in the memory and the voice. So it was that the great mythological cycles of Ireland, the vast inheritance of story that the Druids and poets had carried in their heads, came to be set down in ink by Christian monks who loved the old tales even as they served the new God. Because of their labor, we can still read those stories today, still enter that older imagination and walk among its heroes and its wonders. It is one of the quiet mercies of history that the men who might have let the old world fade chose instead to save it, and that the memory of pagan Ireland was rescued by the pens of the very faith that followed it. The greatest jewel of that saved inheritance is the central tale of what we call the Ulster Cycle, a work bearing the Irish name Táin Bua Cailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. It is one of the oldest and grandest works of literature in all of early Europe, a sweeping story that has been counted among the treasures of the continent's imagination. At its heart lies a war between two of the ancient provinces of Ireland, Connaught in the west and Ulster in the north, kindled over the fate of a single great and famous bull. From so homely a beginning, the cattle raid, the tale rises into something vast, strange, and unforgettable. And through the heart of that story strides its young hero, Cuchulainn, whom later ages have called the Achilles of the Celts. He is a warrior of almost more than human power, able to hold an entire invading army at bay alone at the fords of a river, blazing in battle with a fury that the old storytellers describe in wild and marvelous terms. Yet, like Achilles before him, he is marked for an early grave, and knows it, for his brief and burning glory is bound up from the first with his doom. His splendor and his destruction cannot be prized apart. The one is the price of the other, and he goes toward both with open eyes. There is something in that figure, the bright hero fated to fall young, that lies very close to the deep heart of the Celtic imagination, and perhaps to the human heart itself. He chooses a short life full of glory over a long life quietly lived, and in that choice we glimpse a whole people's feeling for courage and for the shortness of our days. The tale does not flinch from his end, and yet it does not despair of it either, for it holds that a life may be measured by its brightness as much as by its length. It is a thought worth carrying softly into the dark. The story of Cuchulainn has been told and retold in Ireland for more than 1,000 years, passing from the voices of the ancient poets to the pens of the monks, and onward through the centuries to storytellers and writers and singers down to our own time. It lives still in books and in memory and in the imagination of a people who have never let it go. And in that unbroken telling we see, one last time, the great truth that has followed us through all these chapters, that the Celtic world, for all that its empires and its warriors have long since passed into the earth, endures wherever its stories are still spoken, and its beauty still remembered, at the quiet western edge of the world. Let us move gently now toward the years when the old free world of Gaul began to close, and let us hold it softly, for what comes is a long twilight rather than a sudden dark. In the year we would count as 58 before the Common Era, a Roman came north to govern the provinces along the edge of the Celtic lands. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and he was ambitious in a way that history rarely forgets. Over 8 long years he would bend the whole of Gaul beneath Rome, tribe by tribe, valley by valley. But that is the end of the tale, and we are at its beginning, where the rivers still ran through country the legions had never seen. Much of what we know of those years comes from Caesar's own hand, for he wrote it down himself in a book we call the Commentaries on the Gallic War. Imagine him at evening in his tent, dictating the day's marches in cool, plain sentences that carry no doubt in them. It is our richest window into the Celts of Gaul, and we should be grateful for it. Yet let us hold a small tension as we read, for the man describing these peoples was the man conquering them, and he wrote to be admired in Rome, to make his own name shine. So the book is at once a treasure and a performance, truth and advertisement braided together, and the gentle listener does well to remember both. Gaul in those days was not a single country with one heart and one voice, and this, more than any legion, was what undid it. Picture instead a great patchwork of peoples, dozens of tribes, each with its own chieftains and its own quarrels, some rich from trade, some proud and warlike, many of them wary of their neighbors. Caesar understood this landscape of rivalries as a farmer understands his field. He did not need to defeat all of Gaul at once. He needed only to befriend one people against another, to lend his strength here so that he might take it there. And so the conquest advanced not merely by the sword but by the quiet, patient art of division. The doorway through which Caesar entered was a migration. Far to the east, among the mountains, a people called the Helvetii had resolved to leave their homeland and seek new ground, a whole nation on the move with its wagons and its herds and its children, burning their own villages behind them so there could be no turning back. Their road would carry them across lands Rome wished to guard, and in this Caesar found the pretext he had been waiting for. He gathered his legions and turned the great procession back, and though few could have known it then, the checking of that migration was the first stone laid in a wall that would one day enclose all of Gaul. After that, the strong peoples began to fall, one after another, like lamps going out along a darkening street. In the north dwelt the Belgae, reckoned the bravest of all the Gauls, and among them the fierce Nervii, who came upon the Romans once so suddenly that the battle nearly slipped from Caesar's grasp before his discipline drew it back. Let us pass over the fighting lightly, as one passes a closed door at night. What matters for our quiet telling is the pattern. A proud people rising, a hard day, and then the slow settling of Roman order over the land like snow, softening every sharp thing beneath it into silence. Out along the wild Atlantic coast lived the Veneti, a seafaring people whose tall ships rode the gray ocean swells where the flat Roman galleys were not made to follow. For a time the sea itself seemed their ally, their harbors hidden among tides and headlands. But Rome was nothing if not patient and inventive, and it learned, at last, to meet them even upon the water. With the fall of the Veneti, another door in the Celtic world swung quietly shut, and the fishermen who had known those coasts for generations woke to find the horizon changed, and the ships that passed now flying a stranger's colors. Now let us pause on a marvel, for it is worth a slow breath. Along the eastern edge of Gaul ran the great river Rhine, wide and cold, and beyond it lived the Germanic peoples whom Caesar wished to overawe. Rather than merely cross the water in boats, he chose to build a bridge across it, a vast structure of timber driven into the riverbed, raised by his soldiers in a mere handful of days. Then he marched his army over, stayed only a little while, and marched back and took the bridge down behind him. It was less a conquest than a message written in wood and water. Rome can reach you whenever it wishes. Hold that image and marvel at it gently. Twice, too, Caesar turned his gaze across the narrow sea to the misted island of Britain, where more Celtic peoples lived beyond the reach of the continent's wars. In the years 55 and 54 before our era, he crossed the Grey Channel with his ships, the first Roman ever to lead an army onto British soil. Yet these were brief visits more than true conquests, hampered by storms that scattered his fleet and by the sheer strangeness of the place. He came, he looked upon that green and rainy land, he skirmished and made a show of it, and he sailed away again. Britain would remain free for another 100 years, waiting in its mist. Year by year the Roman grip tightened, not always with battle, often with roads and camps and treaties and the slow weight of presence. A garrison here, a hostage taken there, a tribe made friend and then made subject, and the wide old freedom of Gaul narrowing like a valley closing in toward its head. There is something in this gradual closing that aches more than any single defeat, for it is the loss you cannot point to, the way a long afternoon slips toward dusk without your marking the moment the light began to fail. The Celts of Gaul felt it, surely, in their bones, this sense of an old world quietly gathering itself to end. So let us rest here a moment before the storm to come, and let the mind grow still. Picture Gaul on some ordinary evening in those years. Smoke rising straight from 100 hearths, cattle coming home along the lanes, children called in from the fields, the same small tendernesses that fill every human evening in every age. The great men made their wars, but beneath them the ordinary life went on, patient and warm and unhurried. Breathe slowly, and hold that quiet Gaul in your thoughts, the one that lived below the marching. For in the next turning of our story, this scattered, quarreling, beautiful land would find, at the very last, a single voice. The year is 52 before our era, and out of the long fragmentation of Gaul there rises, at last, a man who dreams of unity. He is young, a nobleman of the Arverni, a people of the highlands of central Gaul, and his name has come down to us as Vercingetorix. Let the syllables of it settle softly, for it is one of the great names of this whole story. What he set himself to do was nearly impossible, to persuade the proud and jealous tribes, so long divided that division had become their nature, to lay aside their quarrels and stand together as one people against Rome. That any man could do this at all is a wonder worth holding in the quiet. And, astonishingly, for a season he did it. Tribe after tribe sent him warriors and swore to the common cause, until a great confederation stood behind him such as Gaul had never known. Imagine the campfires of that host spread across the hills at night, the many banners of peoples who had lately been enemies now leaning toward a single fire. Vercingetorix understood, too, that he could not simply meet Rome's veteran legions in the open field and hope to break their iron discipline by weight of courage alone. He was a thinker as well as a fighter, and the strategy he chose was a hard and sorrowful one, asked of his own people rather than of the enemy. His plan was to starve the invader of the land itself. An army on the march must eat, and Caesar's legions drew their bread from the fields and granaries of Gaul as they went. So Vercingetorix asked his people to deny Rome that harvest, to burn their own stores of grain, to empty their own barns, even to give their own villages to the fire, so that the Romans might march through a country that offered them nothing. Picture thin columns of smoke rising over the wide fields at harvest time, over grain that had been tended all the long summer, now given willingly to the flames. It was a bitter sacrifice, made with open eyes, the surrender of one's own comfort in the hope of a greater freedom. For a while, the hard strategy bore fruit, and there came a day that gladdened every Gaulish heart. At a hilltop stronghold called Gergovia, high in the country of the Arverni, Vercingetorix met Caesar and did what few had done. He held him off and turned him back. It was a genuine setback for Rome, a rare stumble in that long and grinding advance, and word of it must have run through Gaul like a warm wind, kindling hope in places where hope had grown thin. For one bright moment it seemed that the impossible thing might truly come to pass, that the many tribes, standing as one, might yet hold their homeland against the tide. But war is a turning wheel, and hope is a fragile thing to carry across it. After Gergovia the fortunes shifted, as they so often do, and Vercingetorix chose to draw his great army back into a fortress town set upon a high hill, a place the histories call Alesia. It was a strong position, ringed by valleys, the kind of height that had sheltered Celtic peoples time out of mind. There he gathered his host behind the ramparts and meant to wait, trusting the walls and the hills and the promise of relief that would surely come. Yet in choosing that hill he had chosen, though he could not know it, the ground on which the freedom of Gaul would be decided. What Caesar did at Alesia has astonished every soldier who has studied it since. Rather than storm the hill and spend his men against its heights, he chose to build. His legions raised a vast ring of fortifications entirely around the fortress, wall and ditch and tower, mile upon mile of timber and earth, to seal Vercingetorix within as a stopper seals a bottle. Then, knowing that a Gaulish relief army would surely come to break the siege from without, he built a second ring facing outward, so that his own men stood between two walls, ready to fight in either direction. Picture it from above, a great town upon its hill, and around it two immense circles of Roman work, a wheel within a wheel. So the strange arithmetic of the siege took shape. Vercingetorix and his warriors were penned upon their hill, and Caesar's army held the double ring around them, and then, in time, the great relief army of Gaul came up behind the Romans, so that the besiegers were themselves besieged, caught between the men on the hill and the host upon the plain. It was a knot of astonishing tension, tens of thousands of lives drawn tight against tens of thousands more, all of it hanging upon those walls of earth and stake. Let us not linger among the clash of it. Let us only understand that everything, the whole future of a people, now rested on whether two walls would hold through a handful of desperate days. The days came, and the relief army threw itself against the outer wall again and again, seeking the one weak place where the ring might be broken and the trapped men set free. But the Roman works held, as Roman works so often did, and at the last the great host from without could not break through. It wavered, and it broke apart, and it melted away from the field, and with it went the final hope of the men upon the hill. We will pass over the hard hours of that failure as gently as we can, and mark only the terrible quiet that must have fallen upon Alesia when the watchers on the ramparts understood that no rescue would come. Within the walls, meanwhile, there was hunger, for a great many people had crowded onto that hill, and the burning of the countryside had left little to bring in. Let us render this softly, as befits a story told toward sleep, and speak not of suffering in its detail but only of its weight. The long days growing thinner, the quiet in the streets, the children kept close, the slow understanding among proud warriors that courage alone could not fill an empty granary. It is one of the hard truths of every siege in every age, that walls which keep the enemy out also keep the defenders in, and that time, in the end, sides with whoever can wait the longest. And so we come to the moment that painters and poets have returned to ever since. Vercingetorix, seeing that all was lost and wishing to spare his people further hardship, chose to give himself up. The old accounts tell how he came before Caesar and laid down his arms, his sword and his war gear set upon the ground, offering his own person in the hope of mercy for the rest. Whatever the exact truth of that scene, hold the dignity of it. A young man who had done a nearly impossible thing, who had made a nation out of quarreling tribes, surrendering himself so that others might be spared. There is defeat in it, yes, but there is also a strange and quiet grandeur that no defeat can take away. He was taken to Rome, and there he was kept for years in confinement, held like a treasure the conqueror was not yet ready to spend. In time, when Caesar celebrated his great triumph through the streets of the city, Vercingetorix was led along in the procession, the living proof of a subdued Gaul paraded before the crowds. And after that day of display, in the shadowed places beneath the triumph's glory, his life came quietly to its end, far from the green highlands of the Arverni. Let us not dwell in that shadow. Let us instead carry his name back to the hills he loved, and let it rest there honored, among the peaks and the rivers that had been his home. With Alesia in that year 52 before our era, the independence of Gaul was, in truth, ended. There would be embers afterward, small risings here and there, but the great flame had gone out upon that hill, and Gaul passed, slowly and forever, into the world of Rome. A whole way of living, ancient and proud and free, was folding itself away like a cloth being put by. And yet, dear listener, let us not close this chapter only in sorrow. Worlds pass, but they leave their gifts behind them, in language and in art and in the shape of the land, and much of what the Celts of Gaul had been would live on quietly in what came after. Rest now, and hold that thought gently, and let the hill grow still. Long ago in our story, when we spoke of war and of the fierce courage of Celtic peoples, a promise was made and then set aside. We said that one day a single Celtic woman would make even mighty Rome afraid, and that her name would be kept until the right hour. Dear listener, the right hour has come at last. Let us cross the grey water once more to the island of Britain, and let us speak her name softly into the quiet. Boudicca, Queen of the Iceni, a people of the flat and windswept country in the east of Britain. Hold the name a moment. For nearly 2,000 years it has not been forgotten, and now you will understand why. Move forward with me now about 100 years past Caesar's day, to the years we would number 60 and 61 of the Common Era. In that century much had changed upon the island. Rome had at last come to Britain in earnest, no longer in brief raids but to stay, and the southern and eastern parts of the land had been drawn into the empire as a province, with Roman towns rising and Roman soldiers keeping the roads. Some British peoples had made their peace with the newcomers and kept a measure of their old standing as client kingdoms, ruling still, but beneath Rome's shadow. Among these were the Iceni, and it is here, in that uneasy arrangement of proud people and distant master, that our tale takes fire. The king of the Iceni was Vercingetorix, and he was a careful man who loved his family and wished to shield them from the storm he saw gathering. When he came to die, he tried to make a bargain with the future. In his will he left half of his kingdom to Rome and half to his own daughters, hoping that by giving generously he might secure the rest, that the great power would be satisfied and leave his household in peace. It was the reasoning of a father, gentle and wise in its way. But Rome, in that place and hour, did not honor it. Where he had offered a share, they took the whole, and where he had hoped for protection, his family found none. What followed was a grievous wrong, and we shall speak of it with restraint, as befits both the dignity of those who suffered and the hush of a story told toward sleep. Boudicca, the widowed queen, and her 2 young daughters were treated with cruelty and contempt by the very power her husband had tried to appease. They were shamed and injured and cast down, a royal family humiliated before its own people, all bonds of honor broken. Let us not detail the harm. Let us simply understand its depth, and understand too that such a wrong, done to a queen before the eyes of her nation, could not simply be swallowed in silence. It lit something that would not easily be put out. And so Boudicca rose. Picture her standing before her people, this wronged queen, tall and grave and burning with a resolve that had passed beyond fear. She called upon the Iceni, and upon their neighbors who had also chafed under the heavy hand of the newcomers, and she found that the anger she carried was an anger shared by many thousands who had only been waiting for a voice. They flocked to her, tribe upon tribe, until she stood at the head of a great rising such as Roman Britain had never seen. Here was the very thing the earlier promise had foretold. Not a king, not a general, but a woman, gathering a nation's grief and turning it into a force that would soon make Rome itself tremble. Fortune, too, seemed for a moment to favor her. The Roman governor of Britain, a hard and capable soldier named Suetonius Paulinus, was far away at the time, campaigning in the mountainous west of the island, his best troops with him and many days' march between him and the rising storm. The rich towns of the Roman East lay open, lightly held, unready. Boudicca and her vast host turned toward them like a great tide drawing back before it rushes in. There was a terrible momentum in it now, a gathering weight of numbers and of long-held wrongs, and for a season it must have seemed to the Britons that the newcomers might be swept clean off their soil and the island made their own again. Her army came first upon Camulogenum, the town we now call Colchester, a proud Roman settlement built upon land the Britons remembered as their own. It could not stand against so great a host, and it was given to the fire. Let us hold this atmospherically, as we have held all such moments. A red glow spreading across the evening sky, sparks rising into the dark, the roar and crackle of it heard from far across the flat country, and then, by morning, only smoke drifting over a silence where a town had been. We will not walk among the streets that night. We will stand instead at a distance, upon a low hill, and watch the light of it and feel the weight of it, and let the particulars stay mercifully in shadow. Then the rising rolled on, and two more towns met the same fate. Londinium, the young trading settlement on the Thames that would one day grow into London, was reached before Suetonius could gather strength enough to hold it, and he made the hard soldier's choice to let it go rather than lose his army defending it. It too went up in flame, and after it Verulamium, near the place we now call St. Albans. 3 towns, 3 red glows against 3 night skies, 3 mornings of ash and quiet. Boudicca's rising had become the greatest danger Rome had ever faced upon the island, and away in the west, the governor was turning his weary legions homeward at last, knowing that everything now must come down to a single meeting. The reckoning came, as such things do, upon a field of the general's choosing. Suetonius, badly outnumbered, was too seasoned a soldier to be dazzled by the vast size of the host against him. He drew up his legions in a narrow place, with woods at his back and rising ground before him, so that Boudicca's great numbers could not sweep around his flanks but had to come at him through a throat of land where discipline would count for more than multitude. It is one of the oldest truths of war, and one of the saddest, that a smaller force well ordered may undo a greater one, and that courage in numbers are not always enough against cold, patient method arrayed upon the right ground. We will pass over the battle itself as gently as a hand smoothing a coverlet, for this is a tale told toward rest, not toward the clash of arms. Let it be enough to say that the day did not go as the Britons had hoped. The Roman line held where it had to hold, and the great rising, for all its numbers and all its fury and all its just cause, could not break it. By evening the field had turned, and the hope that had blazed across the east all that season guttered low. The tide that had risen so high drew back at last, and Boudicca's host, which had carried a nation's grief so far, scattered into the dusk. As for the queen herself, the old accounts tell that she would not let herself be taken and led in chains through Rome as a trophy, as Vercingetorix had been led. Rather than yield her dignity to her enemies, it is said, she took poison and passed quietly out of the world, keeping to the end the freedom she had risen to defend. Let us state it simply and let it lie without lingering. She had lost the battle, but she had not been captured, and there is a kind of victory even in that, the last freedom of choosing one's own ending. So passed Boudicca of the Iceni, into the dark and into the long memory of her people. And what a memory it has been. For nearly 2,000 years her name has been carried down, growing rather than fading, until she stands among the great figures of the island's story, a symbol of freedom and of defiance against overwhelming power, of a wrong answered with courage. In the heart of the very city her army once burned, a statue was raised long afterward beside the river Thames, showing her tall in her chariot, her daughters at her side, gazing out over the London that rose from those old ashes. Hold that image warmly as you rest. Not the fire and not the fall, but the Queen remembered, honored at last upon the banks of the river, the wronged woman who made an empire afraid. Let us turn now to the last free places, the corners of the Celtic world where the old ways lingered longest, and let us begin with the reason the governor Suetonius had been so far to the west when Boudicca rose. He had been marching against a small green island off the coast of Wales, called Mona in the old tongue, which we know today as Anglesey. It was no ordinary island. For generations it had been a great heartland of the Druids, a place of sacred groves and ancient learning, where the keepers of Celtic wisdom gathered beneath the old trees. To Rome it was more than a patch of land. It was the beating heart of everything in Britain that would not bend. Picture the assault as the old accounts half remember it. The Roman soldiers crossing the narrow water to the island's shore, and upon the far bank the Druids and their people gathered among the trees, robed and calling out their prayers against the invaders. For a moment even the hardened legionaries are said to have faltered at the strangeness of it. But the moment passed, and the crossing was made, and what followed we will leave in the merciful shadow where such things belong. What we must mark is the aftermath. The sacred groves cut down, the ancient trees felled, the holy places of the Druids given deliberately to ruin. This was no accident of war. It was a targeting of the very soul of a people. For Rome had come to understand something about the Druids. They were not merely priests but the living memory of the Celtic world, the teachers and the judges, the keepers of a knowledge that had never been written down but passed from mind to mind across the generations. And because they held that memory, they held the seed of resistance. Where the Druids were, the old identity endured, and where the old identity endured, Rome was never quite safe. So the decision was made, cold and deliberate, that the Druids must be ended, not as men only but as an institution, uprooted like the very groves in which they had taught. It is a hard thing to contemplate, this attempt to cut down not an army but a way of knowing. And here we come upon one of the quiet tragedies of our whole story, though it is a gentle one, more sorrow than horror. Because the Druids had never trusted their deepest learning to writing, keeping it all within the trained and living memory, when they themselves were scattered and their schools broken, that knowledge had nowhere to go. It did not survive in books to be found again by later ages. It simply faded as the last who held it passed away, like a song no one had ever written down, sung softly a final time and then gone. A long silence followed where once there had been a vast unwritten library of belief and lore, and we who come after can only stand at the edge of that silence and wonder at all it must have held. Yet not every place could be reached, and this is a comfort worth holding as we drift towards sleep. Far to the north lay Caledonia, the wild highland country we now call Scotland, a land of mist and mountain and long grey firths, and Rome, for all its power, never truly took it. The legions marched north, and there was a great battle at a place the histories call Mons Gropius, somewhere among those northern hills, where the peoples of the north gathered to meet the empire. Though the day itself went against them, the land did not yield its heart. The mountains kept their own, and the far north remained, in its bones, a free Celtic country beyond the empire's grasp. It was on the eve of that northern battle, the old account tells us, that a Caledonian leader named Calgicus is said to have spoken to his gathered people, and though the words come to us through a Roman pen and we cannot know how much is truly his, the thought within them has never lost its edge. He looked, it is said, upon what Rome called peace and named it for what it seemed to him to be. A stillness made only by ruin, an empty quiet left where a living land had been, the silence of a place from which everything has been taken. Let us hold that idea gently and in our own words, this sorrowful insight from the edge of the world, that a peace which is only the absence of all life is no true peace at all. And in the end Rome itself seemed to agree that the far north was not worth the endless taking. About the year 122 of the Common Era, the Emperor Hadrian gave an order that speaks volumes in its very restraint: build a wall. Across the narrow neck of the island, from sea to sea, the legions raised a great barrier of stone and turf, running for many miles over the rolling northern country, with forts and gates and watchtowers strung along its length. Here, said the wall, Rome ends. This far and no farther. And north of that long gray line, the old Celtic world went on breathing the free air, unconquered, as it had always done. There is something to rest in the very idea of that wall. Imagine standing upon it in the evening, a soldier from some warm southern province wrapped against the northern chill, looking out over the hills where the empire's writ did not run. On one side lay roads and towns and the ordered life of Rome. On the other, moor and mountain and the peoples who had never bowed. The wall was not only a defense but a kind of confession, a great stone admission that there were places the mightiest power on earth could reach the border of but never truly hold. Every empire, however vast, comes at last to such an edge and learns the shape of its own limits. So let us hold, softly, this meditation on the edges of things. The story of the Celts in Rome is not only a story of conquest. It is also a story of the places that were never taken, the island heartlands and the northern hills and the wild western coasts where the old world endured. Rome drew its lines and built its walls and thought itself the measure of the earth, and yet always, just beyond the last watchtower, there was more country, more life, more freedom breathing quietly in the mist. Breathe with it now, that free air beyond the wall, and let the great empires grow small and far away, and let the mind rest at the gentle edge where their power ended and the open land began. Let us leave the marching and the walls behind us altogether now, and come all the way down, past the emperors and the generals, past the burning towns and the far frontiers, to a single farmstead in the green country, and to one small warm house within it. This is where most people actually lived, after all, not in the histories but here in the quiet round of ordinary days. So set down the weight of empires, dear listener, and let us step together through a low doorway into a Celtic home, and let the whole wide troubled world shrink to the size of one warm room. Here there is nothing to fear and nothing to decide. Here there is only warmth and firelight, and the slow good rhythm of a life. The house is round, as Celtic houses were, a wide circle of a home. Its walls are built of upright timbers woven through with branches and then daubed smooth with a mix of earth and straw, cool and solid to the hand. Above, a tall cone of thatch rises to a point far overhead, dry reed or straw layered thick against the rain, so that the whole dwelling from without looks like a great gentle hill of gold. There is one doorway and no windows to speak of, and no chimney at all. Instead, the smoke from the fire finds its own slow way upward, drifting through the high dim spaces of the roof and seeping out at last through the thatch, so that on a cold morning the whole roof seems softly to breathe. At the very center of the round house is the hearth, and the hearth is the heart of everything. Here a fire burns upon the earthen floor, ringed with stones, and it is never, if the household can help it, allowed to go quite out. Through the day it is banked low and quiet. At evening it is fed and wakened into dancing light. Through the night it is kept as a bed of glowing embers, so that there is always warmth at the center of the home and always a living flame to carry forward into the morning. Imagine that soft red glow at the heart of the dark house, faithful and unhurried, warming the whole circle of the family who gather in toward it. Let its warmth reach you where you rest. Around that central fire turns the whole slow business of the day. Listen, and let the small sounds gather. There is the low, steady rumble of the quern, the round stone hand mill, as someone grinds the grain into meal, turning and turning. There is the good smell of that meal becoming bread, baked flat upon the hearthstones near the fire. Cattle low softly in the yard beyond the wall, and sheep and pigs rooting somewhere in the mud. These are the wealth of the household, tended morning and evening, counted like treasure. And always, in the corner of the eye, the ordinary life of a home, a dog stretched near the warmth, children underfoot, the endless small tasks that fill a day from waking to rest. There is wool everywhere in such a house, for the making of cloth is one of the great slow labors of the home. Picture the spinning. Raw wool drawn out and twisted into thread upon a turning spindle, a task so constant that hands would do it almost without thought, walking, talking, watching the fire. And then the weaving upon a tall, upright loom leaning against the wall, its threads weighted with rings of clay, the shuttle passing back and forth, building the cloth row upon patient row. The wool is dyed in the soft colors the land itself provides, gentle golds and greens and browns and blues drawn from plants and roots and bark, so that even the humblest cloak carries within it the colors of the meadows and the woods. And should you follow the sound of ringing metal, you will come to the smith at his forge, one of the most honored craftsmen of any Celtic settlement. Here, in the glow of the charcoal fire, worked hot and bright, iron is coaxed into every needful thing. The blade of a plow, the rim of a wheel, a knife, a cauldron, a pin to fasten a cloak, and sometimes, for those who could command it, work of real beauty, curling and knotted in the old flowing style. The rhythm of the smith's hammer upon the anvil is one of the steady heartbeats of the community, a bright, patient ringing that says, without words, that things are being made here, that the life of the place goes on. All of this turns, year upon year, to the great slow wheel of the farming seasons, the very rhythm we have met before in the festivals of the Celtic year. The plowing and the sowing in the freshening spring, the long green growing and the tending of beasts through summer, the gathering in of the harvest as the light begins to soften, and then the drawing inward toward the dark of the year, when the herds are thinned and the stores are laid by and the household turns to its fireside for the long cold months. The house breathes in and out with the seasons as surely as it breathes its smoke through the thatch, and every soul within it lives close against the turning of the sky and the ripening of the land. Now let the day soften toward evening, and let your own thoughts soften with it. The light in the doorway goes from gold to gray to blue. The beasts are settled, the tasks are laid aside, and the household draws in close about the wakened fire. Breathe in, gently, and gather the smells of this place. The sweet gray scent of wood smoke, the warm smell of new bread, the earthy dampness of wool, and, from without, the clean smell of rain beginning to fall soft upon the thatch far overhead. There is the low murmur of talk among the family, easy and unhurried, the small news of the day. Let those quiet voices wash over you the way they wash over a drowsy child, meaning less than their music. And listen now, for as the fire settles and the rain whispers on the roof, one voice among the household begins, at last, to tell a tale. Perhaps the strings of a small harp sound first, a few soft notes to draw the circle in. This is where the great stories lived, remember, not in any book but here, in the warm ring of firelight, spoken aloud into the dark as they had been spoken for 1,000 years. The heroes and the gods, the otherworld and the shining ones, the old battles and the older loves, all of it carried forward night by night, fireside by fireside, breath by breath. The whole vast memory of a people, kept alive in this small circle of light, told over once more before sleep. So let this be your resting place tonight, dear listener, here in the round warm house with the rain on the thatch and the embers glowing low and the storyteller's voice going gently on. There is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to do. The fire is banked and faithful. The beasts are safe. The door is shut against the dark. The household breathes slow and easy all around you. Let your own breath slow to match it. Let the warmth reach into you and loosen every held thing. Let the voice by the fire become a soft blur of sound, no longer words, only comfort. And if you should drift now down and down into sleep, know that you drift in the safest and warmest place there is, at the heart of the fire, at the heart of the home. Now let us lift our eyes once more, gently, and follow the story to its far horizon. the centuries turn, and by the years we would count in the 4th and 5th after the Common Era, the great Western Empire of Rome is fading like a fire left too long untended. The roads fall quiet, the towns grow uncertain, the old order that had seemed eternal begins to loosen and darken across much of Europe. But look now to the west, out across the sea to green Ireland, the island Rome had never conquered, never walled, never taken into itself. There, on the very edge of the known world, something quiet and wonderful was about to happen, a keeping safe of light in a time of gathering dusk. Into this island there came, in the 5th century, a man we remember as St. Patrick. His own story is a strange and gentle one, for he had first known Ireland not as a teacher but as a captive, carried there against his will in his youth and set to herding in its lonely hills, and yet in that hard time he came to love the land and its people. Later he returned freely of his own choosing to bring the Christian faith to Ireland. And he brought it, so the tradition holds, not by tearing down the old world but by weaving the new into it, letting the ancient reverence for sacred places and holy fires flow onward into the new belief, so that the change came softly, like a season turning, rather than like a fire. And so, as learning dimmed across much of the old Roman world, in Ireland it quietly brightened. There rose across the green land a great flowering of monasteries, small communities gathered in stone and turf about their churches, where men gave their lives to prayer and to study. In their quiet rooms by patient candlelight, the monks bent over their desks and copied out books, letter by letter, page by page, the scriptures and the old learning of the classical world alike, preserving in ink what might otherwise have been lost forever. Picture those still rooms while so much of Europe grew troubled. A scratch of pen, a turning page, a lamp against the dark, and knowledge itself being carried carefully across a dangerous age like a candle cupped in sheltering hands. And here, dear listener, the old Celtic spirit did not merely survive. It blossomed anew, more beautiful than ever. For when those Irish monks adorned their sacred books, they filled the margins and the great opening pages with an art of breathtaking richness, and it was the old art, the flowing lines and spirals and endless interlacing knots that we first met long ago among the smiths and metalworkers of the Latin world. Now those same ancient patterns curled and wove their way through the pages of the holy books, tendril within tendril, no beginning and no end. Above all this flowering shines in the great illuminated manuscripts, and brightest of them all in the book we call the Book of Kells, a wonder of color and pattern that still stops the breath of all who look upon it. Hold that image for a moment, for it is the very heart of our whole long story returning to us transformed. Remember how we began with the old flowing Celtic art, born of a people who saw the sacred everywhere in the turning shapes of the living world. Now here it is again, that same restless, beautiful line, but curling through the pages of a new faith, the pagan spirit of the art and the light of the new belief flowing together like two rivers meeting and becoming one wide and shining stream. Nothing was simply erased. The old and the new mingled and were carried forward together, and the beauty that came of that meeting was greater than either had been alone. Nor did the Irish keep this light only for themselves. In time the monks set out from their island, crossing the seas to carry their learning and their faith back to the very continent from which so much had faded. Men such as Columbanus journeyed far into Europe, founding monasteries as they went, and from the little island of Iona off the Scottish coast the light spread onward through Britain and beyond. Picture these travelers with their books and their staffs, going out into a dimmed and troubled land to rekindle what had guttered low. Ireland, which had received and sheltered the light of learning through the dark years, now gave it back to the world, a gift returned with interest to a continent that had nearly let it go out. And so we come to understand the deepest truth of the Celtic story, and it is a hopeful one to hold as we near our rest. The Celtic world was conquered, yes, in Gaul and in much of Britain. Its Druids were scattered and its old freedoms narrowed and its independent power broken. And yet the Celtic spirit did not die. It changed its shape and went on living, carried forward in the curling art that filled the sacred books, in the great tales still told by the fire, in the languages that clung to the western edges of the world, in a whole cast of mind that saw wonder woven through the everyday. What could not be destroyed by any wall or legion simply transformed itself and endured. Let that be the light we carry now toward the quiet, dear listener, this luminous idea that endings are so often only turnings. A whole world that seemed to pass away had in truth poured itself into what came after. Its beauty and its stories and its restless flowing spirit surviving in forms no conqueror had thought to guard against. On the far green edge of Europe, while the old order darkened, a flame was kept and tended and at last carried gently home again. Hold that warmth softly as you drift. Not loss, but continuance. Not a fire gone out, but a fire passed carefully from hand to hand across the ages, still burning, still golden, still ours to gather round in the deepening dark. And so we come, at the last, to the strangest part of the whole long story, the part where the Celts, having lost their kingdoms and their warriors and their Druids, having watched their old world close over like water over a stone, simply refused to disappear. For a people can be conquered without being ended, and a way of seeing the world can outlive every fortress that ever held it. The Celtic world did not so much die as change its shape, slipping out of history and into something quieter and more durable, into story, into language, into the deep memory of the lands where it had lived. Let us follow it gently into that long afterlife. It lived on, first of all, in the tales. The old imagination did not vanish when the old religion faded. It flowed instead into new stories, keeping its wonder and its strangeness intact. In Wales, the tales gathered in the collection we call the Mabinogion preserved a whole shimmering world of enchanted forests and shape-shifting lovers and kings under spells, the last inheritance of the Brythonic bards. And out of the Celtic West rose the greatest story of all, the legend of King Arthur, a British war leader defending his people against the dark, who grew across the centuries into a figure known and loved around the whole world, without most who love him ever knowing the Celtic soil from which he first sprang. It lived on, too, in the languages, though these had the hardest road of all. As the centuries turned, the old Celtic tongues were pressed back and back, westward and westward, toward the sea, retreating before Latin, before English, before the tides of newer peoples, until they clung to the far coasts and the high hills and the islands, to Ireland and Wales, to the Scottish Highlands, to Cornwall and the Isle of Man, to Brittany across the water. They grew fewer and quieter, and more than once the world thought them all but gone. And yet they did not go. Somewhere, always, a mother was still singing to her child in the old speech, and so the thread was never quite cut. And it lived on, most quietly of all, in the names of the land itself, for names outlast almost everything. Rivers still murmur their Celtic names across Britain and the continent, names older than any language now spoken beside them. Towns and hills and whole regions carry, half hidden and unnoticed, the words of a people 2,000 years gone. Every day, without knowing it, millions of us speak a syllable of Celtic when we say the name of a place, so that the old world whispers on beneath the new, patient and unhurried, woven into the very map beneath our feet. It was never truly buried. It was only waiting to be heard. Then, when the old world seemed at its faintest, something remarkable happened. It began to return. In the closing centuries, a great awakening swept the Celtic lands, a revival, as people turned back with love and longing toward the heritage they had almost let slip away. Scholars sought out the old manuscripts. Poets and dreamers gathered up the fading tales, and voices like that of the Irish poet Yeats lifted the ancient stories back into the light and made them new and made them matter again. The languages, too, were taken up and taught and cherished once more, drawn back from the very edge of silence by people who refused to let them end. And that awakening has never really stopped. In our own time, the old tongues are spoken again by children in schools, sung again in music that travels the whole world, printed again in books and carried again in the names parents give their sons and daughters. The knotwork and the spirals that a smith once hammered into bronze, and a monk once traced onto a sacred page, are drawn again today by hands that feel, without always knowing why, that these old turning patterns belong to them. The Celtic world, so often mourned as lost, turns out to be one of the most enduring things that Europe ever made. So let us set down, at the very end, the truth that has followed us quietly through this whole long night. The Celts were never a single empire, never a single nation, never even a single people who called themselves by one name. They were a way of being in the world, a love of flowing beauty over straight and rigid lines, a reverence for the living land, a fierce and stubborn refusal to be told who they must become. Their kings are dust, and their groves are long since fallen, and yet the thing that made them themselves has proven more lasting than marble, more lasting than the empire that overcame them. They are, in every way that finally matters, still here. And now there is nothing more for you to do. The salt mine is dark and quiet in its mountain. The groves are still. The fire in the roundhouse has burned down to its soft red embers, and the storyteller's voice has fallen silent at last. You have traveled a very long way tonight, across 2,000 years and half a world, and you carried none of its weight, and you needed to remember none of it. Let it all drift away now, like mist between the ancient trees, like smoke rising gently through the thatch and into the stars. Let your breathing slow. Let the old world keep watch over you. and sleep, sleep well and deeply and long. Good night.